So, before starting with Romanesque architecture, I'll give you a quick recap. What we studied earlier was the first architecture in the syllabus that we studied was of Greeks, then it was followed by Romans, and then in Rome came early Christian architecture, which was followed by Byzantine architecture. So, this was the actual flow of the different eras that came into being, which were important in terms of architecture. Now, this was according to different eras, but after the downfall of Romans, what happened? The Christian architecture started blooming in that area, but there were certain people who were practicing Roman architecture in different areas. So, Romanesque architecture, as the name suggests, it directly means descended from Roman architecture. By Romanesque, the meaning we get out is descended from Roman architecture. So, most of the features that we'll study in this architecture are actually taken up from Rome. What happened in actual was after the downfall of Romans, what happened? Um, okay, let's look at the map of Europe. So here you can see we have Rome somewhere here. This is the area. So what happened in later on stages, this Romanesque architecture it spread out in Italy. So from here it spread out somewhere here, then it went to France also. So these are the area which were taken up by Romanesque architecture. By this we mean the Roman architecture was being started to practice in these areas. Mostly the Central European area was influenced by Roman architecture. Then, even in Spain, it was followed, and then in Britain also it was followed. So, you can see that these are the areas that were majorly influenced from this zone. मतलब यहाँ from here everything spread out in all these areas, which means the basic features of Roman architecture were followed here. So the features that were being followed, they were arches, walls, and pillars. The major three aspects or architectural elements, they were arches, walls, and the third one is pillars, which we even call as columns or piers. But they modified these things a little bit, and they were different from Romans that we'll study in detail later on. So, the arches, we'll start with the arches first. What happened in arches were Romans loved arches. They used arches in different areas like windows, on doors, entries. So, what happened here was that arches which were being used in Romanesque architecture, they were also in the same way, but they were modified in a little bit different manner. For example, in a doorway, a normal doorway would have a simple archway, and we studied about different types of arches that they used to use. In this, what they started in Romanesque architecture, they started using depressed arch, multiple arches on the doorway. By this we mean they had a descending order of arches placed one before another, and these descended arches. Walls. The walls that of vault that they used was groin vault. I think you all must be familiar with it. Groin vault is actually the intersection of two barrel vaults, right? So the intersection of two barrel vaults is known as groin vault. So the major vault which was being used in this era was the groin vault itself. And coming to the last thing, which are your pillars or columns. So they used it in most of their religious buildings, and they even started having porticos and cloisters, which were having a number of a set of whole colonnade. They, in the residential spaces, they used to have corridors, and they were surrounded by small pillars beautifully carved out, and they used to make this beautiful area which was known as cloister, group of different pillars forming a central space between any area. This can be lawn or a central courtyard or something. So basically, now Romanesque architecture happened to be flourishing after the collapse of Roman Empire, and this was basically developed in the Western Europe. You have to remember this. The main places we have already studied, they are Italy, France, Germany, Central Europe, Spain, and Britain. Now, the next thing that we are going to study, this was all about the geography of the place. The next topic is about the building materials, or we can say geology of the place. Building materials that they used to use. The main feature of Romanesque is that they used ruins of Roman buildings. By ruins, we mean ruins are actually the remains of Roman buildings which were destroyed by any factors or maybe in some. So the remains of old buildings of used by using stone, brick, and marble. Materials that they used to use, but stone was majorly available in France, and Italy is famous for marble and brick, basically the marble. So marble was majorly used in Italy, otherwise stone, brick was used in other places as well. Now the next factor is climate. Now, since Romanesque architecture was spread out in several different areas, so different area used to have different climate. So we had a southern portion of Western Europe and the northern portion. So in south the climate was hot, and in north the climate was cold. And according to different climatic conditions, these people used to have different building construction techniques, which is almost basic whenever we are designing any building of area. Example, talking about the southern area, in south, since the climate was hot, they used to have smaller windows, and the purpose of smaller window is to cut off sunlight. With light comes heat, so if we are cutting off the light, we are also cutting up the heat. So the small if we provide smaller windows, we'll have less heat inside the building. Also, in southern areas, the rainfall was less, so the roofs were usually flat. Now, talking about the northern area, since in northern sorry since in northern area the climate was cold, they used to have larger windows. Since they want more of heat, sufficient large windows and more number of windows. The more the windows, the more the space we get for sufficient lighting. So that was the reason that they had large windows and more number of windows. And in northern spaces, the rainfall was there, heavy rainfall. That's why they used to have and snowfall, both these things were prominent in the northern areas. That's why these people used to have pitch roofs. And why do we use pitch roofs? So that if the water is falling, it can easily drop down from this roof. Otherwise, suppose you have a flat roof over your building, then your water will accommodate in this area, and this can cause dampness in your building. That's why in colder regions we usually prefer taking up sloped roofs or gable roofs, so that the snow as well as the rain could directly go down the building from the roofs. Okay. So the next major thing is the religious conditions of the place. In Romanesque architecture, at the time of Romanesque architecture, Christianity took birth after. And in Romanesque architecture, many buildings which are still existing, and they are churches. Than any other building typology, churches are mostly found as the examples of Romanesque architecture. So what happened in Romanesque was many churches came into being, and the authority of papacy were given power. Papacy is the authority of Pope, and Pope is the main heading authority of Christians and all the religions. So the Pope and the papacy, they started getting much power in the area, and all the bishops, most of the bishops who were senior and who were at good posts, they were given government authorities. They were made government officials. So even the law, rules, and all the responsibilities, all these were shared by bishops, and the government started having religious people inside their constitution, so that they could lead the whole kingdom with a combination of academic and religious activities. Hence the power of churches began to increase. Power of churches and clergy, it began to increase. So since it started flourishing, it started increasing, the major buildings that, and they were mostly cathedrals and churches. And many, for making these churches beautiful and more aesthetically pleasing, better than the older churches, one step was taken in which artists and craftsmen they were appointed, so that they could restore the old art and culture of the Roman Empire, as well as the new empire, a new Romanesque empire which was started to be establishing. So all the artists and craftsmen, they called upon artists and craftsmen so as to restore the art and culture of this empire. Here, even the windows that you find on every floor of this building, they are very smaller in nature. They don't have a big span so as to cater much of heat and sunlight. And talking about the examples that they had in the northern region, so you can see this building is having a perfect sloping roof which can avoid all the rainfall and snow. So you can see every area which is detailed out, it is having a gabled or a sloping roof, and the span of the window here can be seen that it is larger than as compared to your buildings in the south. So this will invite more of sun and heat, and these roofs, they will help in throwing up the water and snow which is coming due to rainfall and snowfall. Okay. The next thing that we are going to study is the major architectural features that we see in Romanesque architecture. So, in early periods, in the early establishment period of the Romanesque architecture, we already studied that they used the ruins of the Roman buildings. And in the later stages, when they started improving their whole financial status and as well as the emotional status of the people, they later on started having their own style. They actually modified the Roman architectural features, but they started calling that as their own style because they somewhat modified some of the things. So the first modification that they did was it was in the walls. So till 12th century Roman walls were used, same Roman walls that we used to study, and the major one was the groin vault. It was majorly used, and other than that the other one was the ribbed vault. But what modification they did in ribbed vault was they started putting up panels inside this ribbed vault. By panels we mean they used to make this rib, and the internal filling was done by and the internal filling is done by different panels, that may be mosaic, that may be stone, that may be tile, and this thing helped in reducing the load of the roof. Which is replaced by different types of panels, the load on this roof was reduced. So overall, the major change that they did was replacing the groin vault with the ribbed vault, which was more modified in nature, and internal filling of the ribs was done with different materials. So this was something new that came into being, because earlier all the walls, all the ceilings, they were made particularly in stone. Then the second modification, the first one was of walls, the second modification was in the plan. Now, the churches that we studied in early Christian architecture, they were having a plan something like this, not very elongated nave also. But these people, what they did, they in the planning they elongated the transept, which by transept I mean they elongated this part, and even they brought it a little bit on the lower side. So what happened now, the plan looks something like this. You have a straight area and then you have a semicircular apse on this side, and the transept would go in a very long direction on this side, and even it will go downwards like this, and they would have proper twin tower on the side and a very grandiose entry also. So this plan which came in Romanesque architecture, this actually represented the actual crucifix form. The plus sign that we see, the cruciform, this is called cruciform. The early churches were not exactly the replica of this concept, but then later on, when in Romanesque architecture, when they increased the span of the transept as well as the nave, they came up with this exact form. So this was the kind of all the spaces were almost the same. The main entry was called narthex, and they used to have side aisles on this side. So these were called side aisles. The central area was called nave. The place where the transept and the nave intersect, this was called as crossing. The last portion is called the apse. They used to have a path to move around, which was called ambulatory path. And even they used to have some radiating chapels on the sides of the apse. These were known as radiating chapels, which were also called as apsidals. So this was a basic plan of the church. And the last one was the change in the choir. The choir is this place in which people can stand and sing the choir. So in this choir was surrounded by a boundary wall. In earlier stages, this choir used to be elevated, but there was no boundary wall around it. So in this, the choir in Roman architecture, the choir was enclosed by screened walls. Coming up to the next thing that they had in their architecture, there was one new building typology which was introduced, which was called towers. The leaning tower of Pisa that we see is also an example of this. So these two towers that we see, these are examples of Romanesque architecture. And the main purpose of these towers were, since the see there were, and these towers were having different kinds of shapes. They were octagonal, they were rectangular, they were circular. So they had almost all the types of towers that they could actually make. And the main purpose of this tower was to secure the place. This was used for security purposes. Why? Since the suppose the land is flat and you have your whole city constructed in this area, and there are some areas which are hilly in nature. You can have your forts and fortifications on this area. And suppose if some enemy is coming from this side, it is very easy for a person or a guard who is standing here to have a clear vision of the people who are coming or who are approaching this area. But when you have a flat land and a person or a guard is standing here, the vision is not that broader as compared to the place when you are elevated on it. Elevation actually helps for security. And what these using several towers, so that if a guard stands here, it is easy for him to look for people who are coming for a war or any other thing. So these towers actually resolved the issue of security in the plain areas. So they started making it in different shapes, and this became a typical feature of Romanesque architecture. This was a kind of a standout thing because all the other building typologies that they were using, they were taken up from Romans. This was something that they introduced on their own. The next architectural features is the arcade. Arcade is a plural form of arches, and columns were basically supported by semicircular openings, and they were arched in nature, and a group of arches is known as arcade. So arcading was done in many areas, in almost all the churches, on around your aisles area, in the corridors of your palaces or major buildings. And in the churches, this was used for separating nave from the aisles. So arcading was one of the major feature of them. Next architectural feature is masonry. So since we studied that stone and marble was majorly used in these areas, so ashlar and rubble masonry was used in construction. Now the next thing is ornamentation. Ornamentation was done in two forms, either in floral patterns or in animal forms. One of the major features of Romanesque was mosaics. They used to make different mosaics, and these were also floral in nature, or they used to have animal forms on it, and they even had stained glass used in the windows as well. So, ornamentation or aesthetically beautiful making features were your mosaics and stained glass. Talking about the walls of the churches or the buildings that they had in Romanesque, they were very broader in nature. They were massively thick with few openings or major openings according to the type of building that they have in different climatic zones. So walls, they were majorly massive in nature, and they were heavily thick, massively thick, since they were made in rubble, and rubble, by rubble we mean stone, and it is very difficult for you to find thinner stones. Stones were taken from quarries which were very broader, and hence the walls were very thick. And the last feature that we have is piers, which are form of columns, and they had very different kind of columns. They had supporting columns, functional columns, which were covered by different floral patterns, and then they had many different floral patterns which were pasted upon your piers, or which were carved, which we can say which were carved on your piers. And they used to have square or rectangular piers mostly. Circular piers were not used, since they had to be more broader in nature, so rectangular or square piers were preferred here. At last, we have other building typologies that Romanesque architecture had, like, but still the major buildings that we see today from Romanesque architecture, they are churches only, because they are the only surviving examples of Romanesque architecture. We can see other buildings also. The other typologies that they introduced, they were townhouses and palaces. They had palaces of very different scales. They had small ones and they had grand ones. Then they had commercial premises as well, which had all the admin buildings and all. Then we had civic buildings, which used to cater all the public demands of the people. Then they had castles, and then bridges, several bridges, and at last, which was the major building, cathedral. So these were the basic architectural typologies, architectural elements, and architectural features that Romanesque architecture basically had.